You can hide the participants that don't have video.
And that's what I'm working on doing right now.
Yeah, Jack, I tried to hide myself and I can unmute and take my live video off, but I don't know how to get my face off of there.
Huh. How do you do that? This is great. Doctor, teach me.
The video settings, and then you can hit hide non-video participants.
Yo, what?
Video settings.
Oh, I see video settings. Uh-huh. Here we go.
Yeah, hide non-video participants. Yep.
Look at that.
Awesome.
Well, I've learned something today. Good night. Good night, everybody.
Well, I'll go ahead and kick off. I want to thank you all for coming, joining our first and what we hope to be a series of video interviews and discussions live now that we can't meet in person due to COVID-19. But I want to thank you all for kicking off our discussion on racial justice and gun violence today. So in the wake of the murders of Black people like George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and others, we figured that for our first of these video series to mark Wear Orange, which is National Gun Violence Awareness Day, which is today, that we would focus on issues of racial justice and police reform and how that intersects with gun violence. So we have a few awesome participants here. Myself, my name is Ethan Nichols. I'm the Executive Director of Ohio Students for Gun Legislation. Jack Jose, who is the President of our Board of Directors. Derek Bauman, a former police officer, community activist, and a executive committee member for the Cincinnati NAACP. Dr. Vanessa Enoch, is an activist and is running for Congress currently, and is endorsed by Ohio Students for Gun Legislation in Ohio's 8th Congressional District. Charmaine McGuffey, who is a career law enforcement officer with the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, and is currently running. She just won her primary in Hamilton County to take on the Republican in November and become the next sheriff in Hamilton County, another one of our endorsed candidates. Desiree Tims is running for Congress, another one of our amazing endorsed candidates, and Alaina Swope, who is another candidate that we have endorsed and is running for state representative. So I want to thank you all for coming and go ahead and kick off. I guess we'll start with you, Dr. Enoch. So what policies do you see as being the best way to reduce and ultimately end police brutality and the deaths of innocent, unarmed Black people?
Thank you for that question, Ethan. I think that we have seen so much by way of gun violence, whether it is at the hands of police officers or at the hands of vigilante civilians who get gun happy or do things either unintentionally or intentionally. So I think as it relates to gun legislation, the most important thing, number one, is to ensure that we have the right legislators in office, the right people in the right positions to hold people accountable for those kinds of things. Because without accountability, people aren't willing or interested in doing the right thing, in restraining themselves in those areas. So that's, I think, is the start. I think we also need legislation. We need to get people engaged. We need people who are registered to vote, and we need to make that registration automatic so that young people can vote and those voices can be heard. Because a lot of the people who have been active and engaged in politics have been reluctant to do anything that will facilitate real change. So until we get individuals active and engaged in voting and making change, no matter what happens at the state and federal level where that legislation has to be passed, it won't even be introduced. So we've got to get the right people in those seats. And in fact, there are several candidates, as you mentioned, who are on here right now who are advocates for sensible gun legislation. And so as we go along, we will, in getting these people elected, we will be able to identify some of those laws and some of the legislation that has to happen. I think there's so much to be done as far as legislation is concerned, that to try and cover all of the laws that I think have to be passed and the legislation that needs to be introduced. There's a laundry list. We'll find that we'll be here all day trying to identify each and every one. It starts with rightful seats to make those important decisions.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Enoch. Derek, earlier, as I'm sure you're aware, Councilman Sittenfeld here in Cincinnati put out a long Twitter thread and a list of proposals that he thinks will help to reduce police violence and increase community trust in our police, among other things. What are your takeaways from that, and what do you think the Cincinnati Police Department can do better, and how can we solve these issues?
Well, thank you for that question, Ethan. I will say that Councilmember Sittenfeld's list that he produced the other night, which I don't have in front of me, but was very comprehensive. I thought was one of the most, and I actually retweeted that and made that statement at the time. I thought it was one of the most comprehensive and well thought out lists of ideas that I've seen in some time. So I would refer folks back to his Twitter feed from the other night to take a look at those. You know, one of the things that stood out to me, and again, we could probably have a whole program just going down those one by one. One thing that's really stood out to me, and that I also heard at the press conference that was held at City Hall last night, out of all of the things that I want to touch on, especially as relates to the students here and the young folks. As far as you know, enacting change within organizations, especially something like police departments, which tend to be conservative, set in their ways. They've done it, you know, and they're comfortable in that. And so you get an organization that's very stratified, ossified, and it's like turning a battleship to make these changes. And so from the outside, we're looking at what we can do to affect these changes. But what can we do from the inside? You know, there's a saying out there that we should be the change that we want to see. So one of the proposals that's talked about is instituting, basically within Cincinnati Public Schools, a public safety academy in the schools, so that we can offer and help foster young folks to go into these roles. Because I think one of the things that we can see, and perhaps Senator Thomas will speak to this, you know, especially within the police unions, with our FOP here in Cincinnati, the police retirees have voting rights. And so you have old timers that maybe worked way back in the 70s that have an old, you know, way of thinking, that still have a voice in shaping how the organization is today, and maybe resistant to changes that the politicians and even the younger officers that are coming into the business today. So I think to the degree that we can get young folks with new ways of thinking and different approaches by nature, let alone us from the outside forcing change upon organizations that, you know, may or may not want to accept and adopt that, to the degree that we get folks on the inside as part of the organization that are thinking in these ways, I think is very important. So just to something that maybe isn't talked about that much, I just kind of wanted to to highlight that aspect. I would love to see that, and more, and a partnership with our schools in that way, and get more young people involved. And thinking about this, not that I'm just going to rage against the machine, but that I'm actually going to be involved, put my money where my mouth is, and make a career of protecting and serving and helping the community.
Thank you, Derek. Senator Thomas, what are your thoughts on the recent events, police brutality, what we can do to increase accountability and reduce deaths there?
Well, the bottom line is that there's, not just locally, but around the country, there's need for police reform in a number of areas. But in order to really have the impact, there's some much deeper issues that that cause us to see what we've seen in Minneapolis. And what I mean by that is that you have two areas of policing. You have your chief of police and your police department and your mayor and your city manager and all your members of council who basically control the law enforcement aspects in our city. But then you also have a subculture of policing that pretty much has a significant amount of influence on your everyday officers out there on the streets. And oftentimes that subculture clashes with what your chief of police and all the others who believe in police community relations, and you try to implement all of these things. But that subculture, which is pretty much driven by your fraternal order of police, that subculture basically drives a lot of the thinking and has a significant amount of influence on young officers. A lot of the older officers and the retired officers will say, look, I know what you learned in the academy, and I know you want to be a good do-gooder and do all these things for the community, but I'm going to teach you how to stay alive. So they tend to stretch the rules and regulations and the policies and procedures of the police department. And they step outside of those rules and regulations and policies because there's a covering that exists if an officer gets himself in a jam. And oftentimes that officer manages to get away with that because in the history of our police department, there was no going back, there was no cameras and all these other things that pretty much caught on tape what the officer was doing. So, and keep in mind, if it's the officer's word against the citizen's word, or they're always going to give the benefit to the officers. So in order to begin a substance of change, we as average citizens are going to have to take on that subculture, which really drives the thinking of so many of our young officers. And for instance, I'll give you an example. The subculture their role, obviously the FOP, is to protect a police officer. That's why you pay your dues. So when you get yourself in trouble, you got the access to the lawyer representing the FOP. So they also negotiate in their contracts protections. A chief of police will tell you it's extremely difficult to get rid of a bad officer off the force, because when we were able to get rid of bad officers, there was negotiations to come up with a better way that everybody felt was fair. Meaning the FOP was saying, hey, we need a neutral party to look at this. So they came up with binding arbitration. And regardless of whether this guy's a good officer in the eyes or bad officer in the eyes of the chief, I don't want him on my job, I don't want him on my force, binding arbitration, say, well, I'm sorry, chief, we got to keep him. These are the kinds of rules and things that are out there. Now, the final, and I'll shut up after this, the final leg of this is the power of the FOP. I akin the FOP and its power to the NRA and its power and influence over our legislators, over members of the people who are running for office. A lot of politicians believe that if I don't get the FOP endorsement, I can't win. So they tend to cater to the FOP. And as a result, they then get on and they protect the FOP and its membership. And I'm not down in the FOP, but what I'm saying is that your FOP has to focus strictly on things that benefit the officer when it comes to negotiating for a job, health and all that stuff. But when you get into the policies and procedures of what's best practices in good policing, that's where we run into a problem. So it's up to those out there to send us people up at the state to help change some of these laws.
Thank you, Senator Thomas. That was great. Alaina, I wanted to get your input. I know that you're running for a state house seat here in Ohio, and what are your thoughts on what we can do better to prevent police brutality, make the police more accountable, and increase community trust?
Yes, thank you, Ethan. Thank you all for being here and having me. I'm honored to be among you all. So things we can do better. Several different levels to this. I think first and foremost, we cannot allow the NRA and other powerful police organizations to continue to lobby our politicians and buy their representation. That has to stop. I think there are several different, actual substantive policies we can pass within the state of Ohio that decrease gun violence overall. We can close the background check loophole, because conservatives will tell you that we have background checks, there's, that problem's solved, but it's not, because there are so many loopholes. The background check system is very weak. We can also require all, gun owners to have licenses in the state of Ohio, because that's another really weak law. And then building community trust with our police forces, I think, has to come with demilitarizing our police force. So we can slowly allocate, budget that we would, money from our budget that we would give to our police. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought a lot today. Allocate money that we would normally give to our law enforcement to healthcare services, to affordable housing, to deepening our social safety net, and slowly start to, when, if there's a situation in which I need to call the cops, I want to call an officer that if it's about something that isn't violent, I don't need that officer to be carrying a gun.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Attorney, I want to get your thoughts as a young activist, a student activist. What are your thoughts on the intersections of gun violence and racial justice and what we can do better?
Definitely, there is a huge intersection between the two. I am originally from Toledo, Ohio, and there was a lot of gun violence within our inner city community, especially growing up and seeing things like that, seeing people like me. I am a biracial 17-year-old, I'm a teenager. Seeing people like me on the news every day, that has really affected my life. And knowing that not only are these people dying, I could possibly become the next victim of gun violence, because police violence is gun violence. Knowing that a normal traffic stop for me could turn into my death, that scares me. That scares me to the fact of, I should be able to trust these people. I should be able to trust the police, and I'm afraid for my life. And on top of that, to know that these people in inner cities face this every day when they should be living a normal life, but because they face high levels of poverty, they have not a lot of after-school activities to keep these kids off the streets, to keep them from not joining gangs. Inner city gun violence is on a huge rise to begin with.
That's awesome. Thank you for your input. Desiree, I wanted to see your input. I know you've worked for a number of senators as an aide, and what are your perspectives on what the federal government can do better to increase community trust, accountability, police reform, and intersections with gun violence? You're muted, by the way. There you go.
Great. Thank you for that question, and thank you so much for having me and for the support of the organization. There is certainly a lot of work that we need to do as a country at the state and federal level. As a former congressional aide, I've seen bills die. Great bills, great ideas get introduced, and then nothing happens. We are not sort of idea deficit in this country. People have great ideas, great policy solutions, and proposals that are on the table that just die. Call it bureaucracy, call it politics, call it the NRA, call it whatever you want. I'm going to say it's a lack of courage. We have so many good ideas that we just need to get done. Of course, there's an intersectionality component of racial justice and gun violence. It's not just a cop sees you and boom, 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 they shoot you. It's the everyday microaggressions that people of color experience. So when that interaction happens with law enforcement, all of those feelings have been suppressed on both sides. They begin to surface. I don't think we're training our officers enough in just diversity training, mental health checks. We talk a lot about mental health when it comes to the person pulling the trigger. We don't talk about mental health when it comes to our police officers. We just need to pour a lot more resources into it. One of the other sad realities is we can't legislate hate. I cannot write a bill or pass a bill and put it into law and get that hate out of your heart. These people need to be removed from the force, period. And so we have daily microaggressions. The racism that we are experiencing and we're seeing in our police departments across the country is something that we experience in our lives. We're in a very segregated society. Ohio is very segregated. Our communities are not diverse as the way they should be. We need to make sure we're allowing people to interact. And so maybe we do need to legislate around revitalization and gentrification to make sure that we are inserting equality in all of that.
Thank you. That was great. That was wonderful input there. Charmaine, I want to get your input on what local law enforcement agencies can do more. I know, especially since you're running for a sheriff's office, what you think the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office and other law enforcement agencies across the country can do better.
Okay, and you broke up there just a little bit, Ethan. As I understood the question, you were asking what the local police, the sheriff's department specifically, can do to, can you repeat that last part?
So what can the local sheriff's office, the police agencies, what can they do better to prevent police brutality, microaggressions, things like that?
Right. Well, you know, certainly training is first and foremost whenever we're talking about how we train officers to initially react to a scene, to come on board with more, you know, socially appropriate responses to people. But also, yes, there are, just as Senator Thomas said, there are those inherent difficulties of, you know, the power of the unions and the old guard that wants to stay that status quo. However, it is my belief that when we put people in those leadership positions, particularly in a sheriff's department, because a sheriff's department, the sheriff is a sovereign office. So the sheriff has a lot more power than, say, sometimes a police chief does, because the police chief is also, you know, governed by the mayor and all the other things that go into that. So, you know, in the sheriff's office, we need to put majors, whoever the chief deputy is in the sheriff's office, those positions need to be people who do believe in de-escalation, who do believe in community outreach, and who embrace those things, because our sheriff's office right now is not bound by any collaborative agreement, and never have we been. You know, if there is going to be a collaborative effort of bringing the community in, that has to be by the agreement of the sheriff. That's voluntary for us. And we are also not bound by many other legislative bodies that locally that influence who the police hire and what their diversity levels are. So, you know, my answer to that question then in short is the leadership in a sheriff's office is so incredibly important, because those are people that really do influence the action, and that's key. You know, you really can, of course, have people in charge of your police department that have a lot of lofty ideas and so forth. But you have to influence that. It has to be action. It's what I plan to do, by the way, is hit the ground running and create action immediately.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Charmaine. Derek, I want to get your input here. What, as a former police officer, what do you see as the best way that local law enforcement agencies can introduce policies to limit and target end-to-end microaggressions, profiling, things like that?
Well, in that regard, I'd kind of like to follow up on Senator Thomas's and really some of the comments that we've heard here, and just kind of amplify that. It's a challenge because we can do these trainings and we can do different things and we can act policies. The policymakers can set this kind of from up here in the ivory tower at 801 Plum Street, and then what actually happens out on the block in Carthage, right? There could be a lot lost in translation there. And so really, I don't think we should underestimate really the work and the scope of the work that's going to be involved here to continue to demand accountability. I think one of the things is that, you know, this feels different to me right now in terms of like the movement, that this has some legs, because what we've seen in the past and what the senator said was absolutely true, that you know, these things are ossified in a system, in an organization that's kind of become its own, you know, a beast of its own over, you know, this hasn't been overnight. This has been decades and decades and decades all in the making, right? And we are seeing it now because of video and because of everything. And so, you know, I think it's going to take a lot of willpower, not only from elected officials, not only from police chiefs, not only from all of these different angles that we've talked about, but from the people as well. You know, we tend to have very short attention spans, right? And something else happens and we go on to the next news cycle and stuff gets forgotten about. This energy that we have right now, and we want our energy to be focused in a positive way. But it can't just fade out and all of a sudden, you know, come 2 weeks if they start playing sports again, that we forget about it and we just, you know, go to the game and have a couple beers and say to hell with it, it's too much work. You know, we heard from somebody like Iris Rowley last night, a longtime, you know, activist in the city of Cincinnati, and much of the progress. And I mean, I will give in Cincinnati, not to sugarcoat anything, we've got issues and challenges and problems, but I think it's been pretty evident here, at least for some of the sickening videos that I've seen from across the country, you know, that it's not as bad here. It's better here than in other places. And I think much of that speaks to somebody like an Iris Rowley, a tireless advocate for 20 years. And she was kind of making the point last night to the young people that I want to pass the baton. I'm exhausted after all of this time, and she's given so much of herself and taken away from her own business and well-being. And she went to Ferguson on her own dime, was there for weeks, you know, helping them through the progress that we made in subsequent to 2001 and the collaborative agreement and all that. You know, the collaborative refresh has been talked about for a while, which I support. But you know, it's what's going on with that. There's some stuff that's kind of on the back burner. And then we move on and think about, you know, other stuff. So I think one of the biggest things or biggest messages that folks have to, you know, stay engaged on this, and we can't just, and it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a lot of work, and, you know, 2 steps forward and 1.5 steps back at some point. And then ultimately, as was mentioned right off the beginning by one of our guests, panelists, voting. You know, we have in our city elections where stuff affects us on a day-to-day basis. We get excited, obviously, if there's a President Obama running and everybody's energized and all of this stuff. And still in the national elections, we have between 60 and 70% turnout. That's of registered voters, not even talking about people that aren't registered. But in our local elections, where you have, you know, your city council members, does everybody know who their judges are that are doing the sentencing and so on and so forth? You know, we have to get engaged on those. In our city of Cincinnati elections, which of course by state law is in an off year. Why is that? Do you think that's an accident, that we don't have city elections And we can't change it. The Ohio Revised Code says it has to be on an odd number year. And so the turnout is down. We only ever have 20, it's consistent. There's all this stuff going on, and it always comes back, a reversion to the mean. We have 27% turnout in the city of Cincinnati for the local elections. And that's of registered voters. And then when you look at the map, where the city tends to be the deepest blue in the middle, and of course we've gotten more blue over time, but as you go out to the edges where it gets, you know, in the outer neighborhoods to the east and the west, it gets more lighter blue and then pink and then into some red, and again that's changing over time. But that map is the inverse of the turnout map. Here where I live and over the Rhine in the core, we get between 5 and 10% turnout. If you look at the low-income neighborhoods, the folks that are most at risk and the most vulnerable to all of these policies, and their turnouts are like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%. But then you go out to the more conservative neighborhoods, and their turnout is 50, 60%, which isn't amazing. But what happens is those folks have an outsized voice because they show up every damn time. And so we need to get, especially for our young people who have, you know, it can't just be about the gram. It just can't be a selfie at an event to the folks that are out here on the street. And the question was asked last night, did y'all vote? You're asking this and that of your council members, but if you're not engaged, and then if you're, you know, I ran for council in 2017, didn't quite make it, but I'll be back. But that was part of my message. You know, as a candidate, I want to hear all the voices. I want to go to all the neighborhoods, but at the end of the day, if you're trying to get elected, where are you going to spend your time and resources? In a neighborhood that has 3% turnout? Like that's a losing political strategy, right? So to the degree that we can get folks engaged and actually vote, and of course there are systemic things that, you know, there's stumbling and roadblocks that we put up, not we, but the other team puts up to keep people from doing that, but we have to overcome it. And so at the end of the day, while there needs to be accountability, and we need folks in elected office to do the right things, and we need all the muckety mucks up here to do the right things, at the end of the day, it's up to us, the folks, to be engaged and remain part of the process and not fade off into the sunset when all this is said and done.
Thank you, Derek. I want to emphasize one of the points, and we've been talking about this at Ohio Students for a while. This idea that the photo opportunity firing or the just pressing charges is not enough, that we need to make sure that we have systemic change so that down the road actual justice happens instead of this sort of Photoshop justice where in the moment, in the heat of the press lights, the mayor makes some major pronouncement and then officer whoever is back on the force, you know, a couple months later, or maybe on someone else's force a couple months later and doing the same kind of abuse, maybe in a smaller place with less accountability. With that said, and maybe Ethan, you can help with directing this question, but one of our people in the audience asked the question, and many of you know that the Minneapolis City Schools broke their contract. They had employed Minneapolis Police to do events, and I'm assuming that happened a lot like Cincinnati Public Schools does, where when you need additional support, you hire police, and they come in and provide that opportunity or provide that support. Does anyone want to kind of handle the question asked by Nate? Do you think Cincinnati Public Schools should do the same thing? Is this a kind of leverage that can and should be used in this situation in Cincinnati?
So Jack, your question was regarding whether they should take the police officers out of the schools, correct?
Well, I think he said ending contracts, and I know that CPS uses them in a couple different ways. They have the officers who are in the schools, and then they also use them for events like basketball games, football games, and for additional security.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. One of the things that I looked at during my doctoral studies was whether or not programs like DARE, where law enforcement officers are inside of schools, whether they work. And the fact of the matter is, consistently, that information that comes out of the schools is that those programs don't work. They're not effective. They don't do what they were designed to do, but they do in fact, contribute to the school to prison pipeline, which is another issue because you're criminalizing children for childlike behavior. And for those of us who are a little more seasoned, we know that as children, we did things that if we were in school today, we'd be criminalized for. There are kids, 5-year-olds who, right here in Cincinnati, arrested for fighting with their teacher in the Northwest School District, arguing with the teacher over a pair of scissors that their mommy bought to the school, and was arrested and on his face, a 5-year-old, a baby. And so those kinds of policies have to stop. And yes, I do advocate for taking police officers out of schools. And I also don't believe in the idea of arming teachers, which was advocated by the president. And that narrative went far and wide and across the country. There are now teachers armed. You know, my husband, who passed away, was a law enforcement officer. And, you know, he complained about officers who did not do what they were supposed to ensure that they were fresh and that their shooting skills were top notch. And yet we're asking teachers to be in a classroom with our children while they're armed and ready to go. This is not what they do. This is not what teachers should be expected to do. And as far as those officers who go from precinct to precinct once they're fired or disciplined, we need legislation that says, no, this is not going to happen. While we're sitting here, I received something from the Attorney General's office asking people to share ideas for law enforcement reform. Well, I'll tell you what, Governor Kasich did the very same thing just a few years ago, and it did not stop some of the things that are happening because of that word that I used when I first spoke, and that is accountability. Unless we're holding these officers accountable, holding the legislators accountable for the policies that they put in place, or for those conversations that speak to a good game, speak to making sure that there's an impact made and yet they don't follow through, or the same system that upholds these kinds of behaviors continue to be perpetuated, unless we hold them accountable, change the people who sit in those seats, and elect new legislators to do something to ensure that something different is done, we're going to keep getting the same things that we've always gotten.
Definitely. Thank you for that perspective, Dr. Enoch. Fraternity, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Ending, as a student, your perspective on ending contracts with the department.
Definitely as a student, I currently, as I said, I moved away from the state of Ohio. I currently live in a state where they're allowing teachers to be armed. I live in a state where I went and I tried to lobby to the fact of, we do not want this as students, and the legislators couldn't even look us in the face. They couldn't even look us in the face telling us that we are the ones with their lives on the line. My main fact was to the fact of, as a student of color, seeing a teacher of color with a gun, that could end their lives. They're going to see somebody with a gun that they deem as dangerous. And to have these police officers in the school as a student of color, it's contributing to the school to prison pipeline. I see students getting away with things that if I did the same thing, I could possibly end up arrested. I could end up in jail. And there shouldn't be a pipeline to allow these students to go from school, to go from a place where they should be safe, and doing a simple thing such as getting into an argument with a teacher, possibly a mental health emergency where they are crying out for help and they end up arrested, where the student should be getting the help that they need instead of getting the police involved. This is a student that is at risk already. In a mental health emergency, the student is already at risk. The student is scared. The student needs help. They shouldn't be thrown in jail or being arrested just for something that they need help with.
That's great. Thank you so much for that perspective. Cecil, Senator Thomas, I wanted to get your perspective on that as a state legislator. Can't hear you, Senator.
You're very low, Senator. You're still very low. Pick your phone up. Maybe it's sitting on something that has your phone.
Ah!
Okay, are we sounding now still low?
It's better.
You're good.
Okay. All right. I guess what I was saying is that I agree with the young lady that just spoke wholeheartedly. The culture of a police officer going into a school has to be managed by the principal of that school. What that officer brings into that class, into that school. And that is an extremely difficult thing to do. So what we oftentimes find out, we get from all of that is that there are situations where kids in particular coming from very difficult environments, and they are bringing a lot of mental health issues into the school. And the last thing you want to do is misidentify a child's behavior, which is what police officers in many of the schools do all the time, and have that child arrested and sent to juvenile detention when that child was, in essence, having a mental breakdown for some very difficult task that they're going through in their environment outside of the school. It could be bullying in the school. It could be a number of things. And without that training of being able to identify mental health training and all these other areas, that creates as we all hear, a school to prison pipeline. I've introduced legislation since I've been in the State House. Senate Bill 23 was basically a criminal justice reform bill. It didn't go anywhere, but then others from the other side of the aisle decided to, well, they took pieces of it and changed it to the point where there was no real teeth to what I had been presenting. I'm going to be reintroducing Senate Bill 23, matter of fact, next week. The other bill that I'm introducing is oftentimes, I think I mentioned earlier about getting rid of bad officers. Well, what I'm going to be introducing is a decertification. In order to be a police officer, you have to be certified by the state of Ohio through OPATA, Ohio Police Officers Training Program. You have to be certified in order to, be a police officer. So if an officer commits some egregious act and he's fired from, say, the Cincinnati Police Department, he will lose his certification, meaning that he will not be able to go to a department next door and pick up where he left off. In other words, that certification, he could not be a police officer. That bill is going to obviously get a significant amount of opposition from the Fraternal Order of Police. But the young lady is right on point. Probably better to allow your principals and your schools, if you still have to have officers in your schools, then the principal should be the one to decide whether a child should be physically arrested or not. And I would think in most cases that principal would probably say no.
Thank you, Senator Thomas. That was very helpful. Very interested to see where your bill goes in the state Senate. We're getting close to our ending time now, but I want to ask each of you your thoughts on something that's been coming up on our Twitter feed recently. Alaina Swope, who was on the call earlier, is one of our endorsed candidates for the Ohio State House. And she has been supporting an idea on Twitter to essentially have candidates who sign a pledge to stop taking donations from the Fraternal Order of the Police and other law enforcement agencies, and to then take any donations that they have received and donate those funds to an anti-racist organization or the YWCA, Black Lives Matter, or a bail fund. I want to get your thoughts on that, starting with Dr. Enoch.
Well, first of all, I have not taken any money from any law enforcement groups, and I would absolutely support that. I think that one of the challenges that we have in politics, period, is in politics and really governs the behaviors of some of the legislators. I think that we need to get the money out of politics from that standpoint. The guy that I'm running against takes corporate money, and because he takes that corporate money, he votes against the people of the district every time. So rather than having legislators and representatives who don't represent, I think it would be good not to have that. And that way, everybody who might run for office would have the best interest of the people at heart that they represent.
That's awesome. Thank you for that perspective. Senator Thomas, what are your thoughts on not accepting donations and support from organizations like the Fraternal Order of the Police?
Well, I agree. You should not. The Fraternal Order of Police obviously is part of the criminal justice system when you really think and you look in a broader perspective. But you also have judges and prosecutors who judges donate to the prosecutors, and judges get involved in getting sheriffs elected and things of this nature. So our whole method by which we campaign contribution reform needs to take place. And they're just, I was looking at a family member, I believe it was Judge Kubicki's, I believe he's the junior, but the father gave $10,000 to Joe Dieter's campaign. And then other individuals give $25,000. In other words, you're buying your candidate. Now, if I'm a, oops, sorry about that. If I'm a person and I got to go before, say, Judge Kubicki, it would probably be very difficult for me to think I'm going to get a fair, ruling if Dieters says, look, Judge, I need you to take care of this for me behind the scenes. Well, if the father gave $10,000 to the campaign, or if another judge gave $1,000, or whatever the case may be, you've opened the door for some unwritten corruption. So I think that we need to get the money out of politics as much as possible and just let the people decide. Just me.
Thank you, Senator Thomas. Charmaine, what are your thoughts on the proposal for candidates to sign a pledge to not accept money from organizations like the FOP and to return any cash donations they have received and put that money to an anti-racist organization or Black Lives Matter or a bail fund? What are your thoughts on that? You are muted.
There we go. I think it is absolutely correct that you can buy influence in political campaigns by, there should be, those.
You're cutting out, Charmaine, but we'll try and come back.
Sorry, I have my internet up here is a little bit dicey, but I do agree that campaign funds should not be accepted from those organizations who will then have undue influence on decision making policy, things like that. So yeah, the sooner we could get reform, particularly on the money end of running for office, then, you know, we've seen too many people that buy their way into a political office, and it's bad policy. So
thank you for that, Charmaine. Derek, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I retired from the Mason Police Department in 2016, led the fundraising effort for Sonny Kim's family after Officer Sonny Kim was murdered in 2015, and we raised over $200,000 in that, and the FOP still didn't endorse me because I've been outspoken about criminal justice reform. I know what some of the ins and the outs are, and so they can't necessarily, folks that would want to can't pull the wool over my eyes in that regard. So to be honest, I don't think I have to be overly concerned with them writing me any big checks. So I'd be happy to sign that. Having said that, I did, before we leave, I know we're coming up on the end of the time, I did have a couple of action items for everybody. We were talking about the arming the teachers, which is the worst idea ever. And I was actually asked by there are some parents that sued the Madison local school district up in outside of Dayton, and because they were going to allow their teachers to be armed, and the policy governing that was like the front and back of one page. It was like, didn't require hardly any training. There was really no standards, et cetera, et cetera. So as a subject matter expert, a former police firearms instructor, I opposed that. We actually won that court case just very recently, within the last month or two. And then meanwhile, there is a Senate bill out there, Senate Bill 317, to basically overcome that court ruling to make it illegal for arming teachers in schools. And so we're asking folks now to get engaged on that. I have the fact sheet here from every town rejecting Senate Bill 317. So we want to contact our legislators about that. And also House Bill 178 in the state of Ohio, which would permit permitless carry. So, anything goes out there in terms of carrying firearms, no training requirements, who needs all that? And so we're asking folks to contact your legislators and oppose Senate Bill 317 and House Bill 178.
Thank you, Derek. It's a lot of great information. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists here. And for those of the panelists that are running for election this year, I hope you'll consider voting for them or contributing to their campaign. I also just put our new fundraising link in the chat. We are now using ActBlue to process all of our donations online. And I would hope that those of you who are able to would consider going there and making a contribution to allow us to continue our advocacy and organizing work across Ohio. Thank you so much for coming, and this video will be out as a recorded video on our YouTube and social media channels later today. So thank you all so much for coming out, and have a great day.
Thank you. Have a great one.
Thank you guys so much.
Ethan. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.